For almost a century, students, journalists, and even politicians have repeated one of the biggest myths in American history. World War II ended the Great Depression. It's a clean story. Simple. Patriotic. Factories reopened. Millions got jobs. America became a superpower. Victory was achieved, and prosperity returned. But the real truth is far more complex, far darker, and far more astonishing than the narrative we all memorize in school. As you watch this, I want you to pay close attention, stay until the very end, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Because what actually ended the Great Depression is a story most people have never been told. To understand what truly broke the back of the Great Depression, we have to rewind to the early 1930s. Not after Pearl Harbor, not during the war boom, but back to the moment the U.S. economy collapsed into a level of despair no modern nation had ever experienced. By 1933, 1 out of every 4 Americans was unemployed. The stock market had lost almost 90% of its value. Over 9,000 banks had failed. People weren't just broke, they were terrified of money itself. The Federal Reserve was powerless, the government was confused, and ordinary families lived in brutal uncertainty. Breadlines stretched for miles. Farmers watched their crops rot because prices fell below the cost of even harvesting them. Children starved. Entire towns vanished from the map. And then came Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected in 1932 with one promise: bold, persistent experimentation. He didn't promise perfection. He didn't promise miracles. He promised action. And in his first 100 days, he launched the most aggressive economic rescue plan the world had ever seen. Banks were shut down and inspected. Deposits were guaranteed by the government. Federal agencies were created overnight to tackle the crisis. Farmers were paid to limit their production, which stabilized falling prices. Millions of jobs appeared through massive government programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Public Works Administration, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. These programs built dams, planted forests, and electrified rural America, completely transforming the landscape. But even here, we have to crush another myth. The New Deal reduced the suffering, and it did so dramatically, but it did not end the Great Depression. By 1937, unemployment had dropped from 25% to around 14%. The economy was rebounding. Factories reopened. Confidence was returning. But the economic machine was still incredibly fragile. In fact, when Roosevelt cut government spending, believing the recovery was strong enough to stand on its own, America plunged right back into another depression. This was the 1937 to 1938 recession, often called the Depression inside the Depression. Industrial production collapsed by a third. Unemployment shot back up. Wall Street panicked all over again. So clearly, the New Deal provided relief, reform, and most importantly, hope, but it did not deliver the final death blow to the Depression. So what did? This is where you have to forget everything you've heard and just follow the evidence. What truly ended the Great Depression wasn't one single event, but a sequence of 4 massive economic transformations that permanently rewired the American economy. Some were triggered by the war. Others happened before the war ever started. And one of them, arguably the most powerful one, had almost nothing to do with World War II at all. First, the United States underwent the largest monetary expansion in its history. When Roosevelt took office, one of the first things he did was sever the dollar's link to gold. He devalued the dollar, revalued gold upward, and forcibly pulled gold from private hands into the Federal Reserve. At the same time, with the rise of dictatorships in Europe, millions of people around the world grew terrified. They saw America as a safe haven and began dumping their gold into American banks for safety. This massive influx of gold didn't just sit in a vault. It became the fuel for unprecedented money creation. Between 1933 and 1940, before America entered the war, the U.S. money supply increased by nearly 60%. That alone sparked a huge recovery before a single American tank ever rolled off an assembly line. Second, the New Deal created a bedrock of federal infrastructure that we still use today. We're talking about bridges, roads, dams, and power plants. It electrified the South. It mechanized agriculture. And critically, it trained millions of workers in new skills. These were the very workers who would later transition seamlessly into wartime jobs. In other words, the war didn't create America's industrial boom out of thin air. It accelerated a boom that the New Deal's reforms had already put in motion. The foundation was already being built. Third, something far less talked about occurred. Consumer confidence slowly returned because the U.S. finally built a functioning social safety net. Programs like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and new labor protections didn't just help individual workers. They stabilized the entire economy. For the first time, people knew that if they lost their job, they wouldn't be left with absolutely nothing. This reduced the kind of panic-driven spending collapses that had made the Depression so severe. People were no longer terrified of a total wipeout, and that security fundamentally changed their economic behavior. And fourth, yes, World War II did unleash unprecedented industrial output. But here is the critical twist, the part everyone gets wrong. It wasn't the war itself that ended the Depression. It was the government's sudden willingness to spend without any limits. Not even the most ambitious New Deal programs dared to spend on this scale. During World War II, the U.S. government spent more money in just 4 years than it had spent in its entire previous history combined. Think about that. More than 150 years of spending, all packed into 4. This level of spending, not the war, but the economic policy behind the war, finally absorbed all the idle labor and capital in the country. Factories that had been quiet for a decade were suddenly running 24 hours a day. Unemployment, which had been at 25%, fell to just 1%, the lowest level in American history. Private companies that had been bankrupt a decade earlier suddenly became global giants in steel, aviation, machinery, chemicals, and electronics. Millions of workers, including women who entered the labor force in huge numbers, got jobs, and many never left. After the war, instead of collapsing back into a depression as many economists feared, America boomed. Why? Because the industrial base, consumer demand, the national infrastructure, the financial system, and the labor force had all been permanently rewired. So, what ended the Great Depression? It wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a war. It was a radical transformation of America's economic engine. A transformation that began long before the war, was accelerated during it, and matured in the decades that followed. It was the combination of a massive monetary expansion, the building of modern infrastructure, the creation of a social safety net, and finally, a level of government spending that was previously unimaginable. This is the real story, the one that tells us how America truly emerged from its darkest economic hour. What really ended the Great Depression? To answer that, we have to tear away the Hollywood version of history and look at the engine underneath the American economy. An engine that was deliberately rebuilt, piece by piece, throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Because the story you're used to hearing, that the Depression magically ended when World War II began, skips the most important chapters. Chapters that reveal how America rewired its entire economic system in a way no nation had ever done before. And in this video, you're going to see exactly how that engine was built, upgraded, and ultimately unleashed. Our story starts with the monetary revolution of 1933, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt took the United States off the gold standard and revalued gold higher. Most Americans didn't understand what had just happened, but the implications were seismic. For decades, the U.S. economy had been trapped in a rigid monetary system where the supply of money was limited by the gold sitting in vaults. When banks collapsed between 1929 and 1933, people hoarded gold and cash, shrinking the money supply by a third. That's a death sentence for any economy. Roosevelt changed everything. By decoupling the dollar from gold, he unshackled the Federal Reserve. Suddenly, the Fed could expand money, credit, and reserves at a massive scale. Then, as Hitler rose to power in Germany, a wave of frightened Europeans poured their gold into America for safekeeping. The Fed used that gold to print money, billions of dollars of it, injecting life back into financial veins that had long turned cold. This alone created a powerful recovery wave before the war even began. Industrial production surged. Car sales jumped. Steel plants that had been silent for years roared back to life. In fact, from 1933 to 1937, the U.S. experienced one of the fastest economic recoveries ever recorded. And it all happened before Pearl Harbor. But because historians love to package the Great Depression into a neat before the war and after the war story, this part of the miracle is often completely ignored. But money alone wasn't enough. An economy needs more than just fuel. It needs confidence, demand, and stability. And that came from one of the most ambitious social transformations in U.S. history, the New Deal. The New Deal wasn't just about building dams and roads. It was about rebuilding the fundamental relationship between the government, workers, and industry. Take the introduction of Social Security in 1935. For the first time in American history, citizens had a guaranteed income in their old age. This created a profound psychological shift. People no longer feared total, abject ruin. And when human beings feel secure, they spend. When they spend, the economy grows. Then came new protections for labor. The Wagner Act gave workers the power to bargain collectively. The Fair Labor Standards Act introduced a minimum wage and overtime pay. At the time, critics screamed that these policies were economy killers. But they did the opposite. They helped create a stable, loyal, middle-class workforce that could sustain consumer demand for decades to come. Again, this wasn't the war. This was the pre-war restructuring that quietly set the stage for the boom that would follow. Agriculture was transformed, too. The Agricultural Adjustment Act stabilized crop prices and put a stop to the catastrophic overproduction that had ruined so many farmers. And rural electrification brought power to 90% of American farms within a decade. This wasn't just about light bulbs. It created massive new markets and new jobs, as farmers bought washing machines, grain dryers, and electric pumps. Still, the Depression wasn't dead yet. By 1938, the recovery stumbled. Unemployment rose again. Industrial production faltered, and businesses grew cautious. What happened? Roosevelt, worried about the national debt, had cut government spending. This triggered a collapse in demand, a painful experiment that taught the world a crucial lesson. A recovering economy is like a patient leaving surgery. If you withdraw the oxygen too soon, the body collapses. So, the government reversed course. Spending soared. Public investment surged again. And by 1940, still a full year before the U.S. entered the war, the economy was rising once more. The engine was rebuilt and running, but it was about to get a supercharger. That accelerant was the Second World War. When global conflict erupted in 1939, America initially stayed out. But it became the arsenal of democracy, selling weapons, vehicles, machinery, and supplies to Britain, France, and China through massive programs like Lend-Lease. These were not small operations. Shipyards expanded, steel mills roared 24/7, and the aircraft industry exploded, going from producing 3,000 planes a year to 300,000 over the course of the war. But again, the key is understanding why this finally ended the Depression. It wasn't just war. It was unlimited fiscal stimulus. The U.S. government did something that was previously unthinkable. It spent more than 6 times its annual revenue every single year of the war. Think about that. Today, we argue fiercely about deficit spending. Back then, it was a necessity that created a miracle. The government absorbed every idle worker, every idle machine, and every idle factory. Unemployment didn't just fall, it vanished. And with the draft pulling millions of men into the military, women entered the workforce by the millions, permanently expanding America's labor base. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a propaganda poster. She was a structural economic shift. She represented a doubling of the workforce that would remain long after the war. Factories operated nonstop. Production tripled. Corporate profits soared. Small companies became industrial giants. And the pace of innovation accelerated, creating breakthroughs in chemicals, aviation, engineering, electronics, and medicine that would define the rest of the century. By 1945, the U.S. wasn't just recovering. It was transformed into the greatest industrial power the world had ever seen. And here is where the final, crucial twist in the story happens. The part almost no one talks about. The Great Depression didn't truly end until after World War II. Yes, after. When the war ended, many economists and politicians feared an immediate return to the Depression. After all, how could the economy possibly survive without massive wartime spending? But something miraculous occurred. The engine that had been so carefully built over the previous 15 years was finally unleashed on a peaceful world. Returning soldiers, armed with the GI Bill, bought homes, triggering a historic housing boom. Suburbs exploded across the country, and the massive savings that families had accumulated during wartime rationing were unleashed in an epic shopping spree. America had millions of new families who needed new homes, new cars, new appliances, and all of this was powered by new jobs. And behind it all was the industrial base built in the 1930s and perfected during the war. It was all there, ready to go. So, you see, the Great Depression didn't end because of a single event. It ended because America re-engineered its entire economic system over 15 years. A new monetary policy, vastly expanded industrial capacity, social safety nets, new labor rights, modern infrastructure, a stable agricultural sector, and a newfound willingness to use massive government spending to fight downturns. It was a slow burn that turned into an explosion. This is the blueprint that modern governments still follow, from the 2008 financial crisis to the pandemic recession. Because the lessons of the Great Depression didn't just fade into history. They became the foundation of modern macroeconomics. But here's the twist most people never learn in school. The Great Depression didn't truly end because of factories roaring or soldiers marching. It ended because the world itself was rebuilt from ashes. What finished the job wasn't just wartime spending, it was what happened after the guns went silent. And this is where the story becomes far bigger, far stranger, and far more important than any textbook will ever tell you. By 1945, the global economy was a wreck. Europe's cities were skeletal ruins. Asia's industrial base had been bombed into dust. Even victorious nations were exhausted, broke, hungry, and traumatized. But instead of sliding back into economic chaos, which many leaders feared, something unprecedented happened. The United States seized the moment and redesigned the economic structure of the entire planet. The result was so massive, so transformational, that it didn't just end the Great Depression, it created the modern age. Let's start with the biggest, boldest move, the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944. Picture this, 44 countries gathering in a quiet hotel in New Hampshire, secretly planning the financial blueprint of the post-war world. In that isolated mountain resort, far from the bombings and battlefields, a new global order was written with ink that still shapes your life today. The U.S. emerged from World War II as the world's only industrial superpower, untouched, fully intact, and overloaded with gold. So the world agreed, under American leadership, to link their currencies to the U.S. dollar and the dollar itself to gold. It was the birth of the Bretton Woods system, and it did something revolutionary. It stabilized global currencies. It encouraged international trade. It allowed countries to rebuild without falling into repeated financial collapse. With one agreement, the U.S. became the engine of the world economy. And that engine needed fuel. Factories that once built tanks began producing cars, refrigerators, washing machines, things the average family had never owned. Soldiers returned home with savings, GI Bill education benefits, and a desire to build families. Housing boomed. Suburbs exploded. Consumer capitalism, the very system we live in today, was born almost overnight. And then came the Marshall Plan, one of the most extraordinary economic operations in human history. Between 1948 and 1952, the U.S. sent over $13 billion, over $150 billion today, to European countries to rebuild roads, ports, cities, farms, and industries. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. By rebuilding Europe, America created trading partners, prevented another depression, and locked in its role as the center of global finance. Factories in America stayed busy for years supplying materials, machinery, and technology. It created millions of jobs and launched the greatest economic expansion ever recorded. Think about that for a second. The war ended the depression, but the recovery of the world kept it from ever returning. But the story isn't just economics, it's psychological. People who had lived through hopelessness now believed in possibility again. Consumers began spending without fear. Banks began lending without panic. Governments invested in infrastructure, science, and technology like never before. The world went from the darkest economic era in human history to the brightest explosion of growth humanity had ever seen. In other words, the Great Depression ended when fear died and confidence returned. Yet here's the part that will shock most viewers. Almost nothing about this outcome was guaranteed. If the U.S. had retreated into isolationism after the war, the world could have easily plunged into another depression. If the global financial system hadn't been redesigned, old problems would have resurfaced. If governments hadn't learned from the mistakes of the 1930s, cutting spending, raising tariffs, ignoring suffering, history might have repeated itself. But instead, the world chose cooperation over chaos, reconstruction over revenge, planning over panic. And from that choice came the modern global economy. The highways you drive on, the credit system you use, the global trade networks that stock supermarkets, the dominance of the US dollar, the middle class as we know it, even the existence of economic policies like stimulus, central banking, and international development. All of it traces back to the moment the world rebuilt itself in the wake of catastrophe. That is what ended the Great Depression. Not just war, not just spending, but a complete reinvention of global economics, driven by painful lessons and shaped by nations determined never to experience such devastation again. It's a reminder that economic collapse isn't just about numbers. It's about people, decisions, cooperation, and the courage to reinvent the future. And if you're watching this right now, take a moment and let that sink in. Your life today exists because the world refused to repeat its darkest chapter.